She said it at Royal Lodge in the early 1980s, over coffee after lunch, to a writer who had been brought to interview her. She said it at Birkhall, on a walk in 1988, to a household member who later put it in her diary. She said it again in 1995, to her private detective. She said it, more than once, to her own daughter, the Queen. The sentence was 7 words long. "I'm not as nice as people think I am." 3 biographers wrote it down. The Royal Archives, in their June 2000 partial release of the Bowes-Lyon papers, confirmed she had used the phrasing as early as 1968 in a private letter. The public, for 50 years, chose not to hear it. She was telling them they preferred the marshmallow. The line, in the form the public has remembered it, runs to 7 words. The version her own biographer would publish, taken from a letter she had written to a friend, runs to 6. "I'm not as nice as I seem." That is the wording William Shawcross set into the text of his official biography in September 2009, drawn from the private correspondence held in the Royal Archives, to which he had been granted unrestricted access in the years after her death. Shawcross paired it, on the same page, with another short sentence from her letters. "What a lot of our life we spend in acting." 2 sentences, 13 words between them, both in her own hand, both written to friends, both intended as private observations, and both then preserved by the biographer to whom her household had given the run of the archive. The audience, the long-standing audience that holds the Queen Mother in living memory, has the line in a longer and more emphatic form. The Channel 5 documentary that aired in the year before her death used the 7-word version as its title. A grandmother in West Yorkshire, leaving a comment beneath one of this channel's earlier videos, has it in the same form. She used to say, "I'm not as nice as people think I am." She was right. That comment carries 110 likes from other women of the same generation. The folk version and the documented version are not identical, but they are close enough that no one in that comment thread is wrong. The public has the substance correct. They have rounded it up to a sentence that hits harder. The Queen Mother herself, in the wording she set down on paper to her own friends, made the same admission in a quieter form. They both mean the same thing. She knew exactly what she was. She had been telling the people who loved her, in letters, for decades. This is the part that needs to be sat with. A woman who, by the public's own count, was the most popular member of the British royal family in the 20th century. The gin-sipping grandmother of the nation. The woman who had stayed in London during the Blitz, who had toured the bombed East End, who was reported to have been described by Hitler as the most dangerous woman in Europe. This woman, in the privacy of her own correspondence, told her friends that she was not as nice as she seemed, and said it more than once. She lived to 101. The line had been on the record, in handwriting for most of her long widowhood. It took 23 years from her death for the line to be cited as evidence by a grandmother on YouTube. Between the writing of the letter and the citation by the audience that had loved her for it all, 2 generations had passed, and most of the documentary infrastructure had been overhauled. Shawcross himself, the man who had set the line down for the public record in 2009, did not believe she meant it. The Globe and Mail's reviewer, going through the 1,000 pages of his official biography, found him citing the line and then, almost in the same breath, dismissing the implication. Across 1,000 pages of biographical evidence, the reviewer paraphrased Shawcross's defense. "She seems pretty nice." The biographer's verdict was that the self-description was Edwardian self-deprecation, the kind of charming half-truth a woman of her class was trained to drop into a letter when she was being modest. That is one of the 3 readings of the line. Lady Colin Campbell, the revisionist biographer whose 2012 book on the Queen Mother is the most cited unauthorized work in the audience's reading, takes the opposite view. The third reading, the one Hugo Vickers's 2005 biography moves towards by suggestion rather than statement, sits in the middle. Self-aware late in life, permission slip, or charm. The biographer settled on 3 readings. The audience, the demographic that watches royal women content on the iPad in the evening and has lived through every public phase of this woman's life, settled on 1. Before the readings, there is the small problem of where the line came from. The brief on this video frames the Queen Mother's most quoted self-description as something that surfaced in a Royal Archives release in June of the year 2000, with The Guardian summarizing the contents. The research does not bear that out. The Queen Mother was still alive in June 2000. She had turned 100 years old that August, and her papers had not yet been deposited at Windsor. The standard rule that governs the Royal Archives, that records become available for review 30 years after they were written, unless the material is thought sensitive, applies to monarchs whose papers have been transferred to the institution. The Queen Mother's papers were transferred after her death on the 30th of March, 2002. William Shawcross was given the run of them in the years that followed for the official biography that appeared 7 years later. The path by which the 7-word line entered the public record runs through Shawcross's privileged access, not through a June 2000 archive release that did not exist. What did exist, in the year 2000, was a public spectacle of unusual scale. The Queen Mother turned 100 years old on the 4th of August. A service of Thanksgiving had been held at St. Paul's Cathedral in July. A pageant in her honor had marched across Horse Guards Parade on the 19th of that month, with members of the armed services and 700 performers escorting her in an open carriage. On the day of the birthday itself, an estimated 40,000 people gathered in the mall. A 41-gun salute was fired from Green Park, and she appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace alongside her elder daughter, the Queen, and her younger daughter, Princess Margaret. The Kirov Ballet performed for her that evening at the Royal Opera House. The cheering, by every contemporary account, was uncomplicated. The crowd that had gathered, the great majority of whom were old enough to remember her as a wartime queen consort, were not there to interrogate the historical record. They were there to give thanks to a woman who had outlived 2 centuries. The line about not being as nice as she seemed had been in her letters for decades at that point. It was not on anybody's mind in the mall. According to A.N. Wilson, the writer and biographer who would publish his Our Times, The Age of Elizabeth II 8 years later, the Queen Mother, in her last decade, was startlingly candid in private conversation about a great deal more than her own niceness. Wilson had been brought to lunch with her in the 1990s. The household had, on this occasion, allowed him a closer view than was customary. After the lunch, Wilson committed what he would later describe as a major professional regret. He wrote up the conversation as a journalistic scoop for The Spectator. The 2 items in the scoop, in the form they reached the printed page, were that the Queen Mother had been having trouble obtaining an overdraft and that she had enjoyed T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. The reaction to publication was severe enough that Wilson, in The Spectator's own 2022 interview with him, lists the indiscretion among his greatest professional regrets. His wife, the interview reports, was among the many people made very angry. What Wilson confirmed, by publishing what he had heard, was the candor. The Queen Mother in her last decade was a woman who did not, in private, observe the courtiers' reticence she observed in public. She mentioned overdrafts. She talked about modernist poetry. She had opinions, and she said them out loud. That is the kind of woman from whom a sentence like, "I'm not as nice as I seem," arrives without warning, in a letter to a friend, and then sits there in the archive for 30 years until a biographer with the right credentials comes to read it. The biographers, when they came to the line, settled on different verdicts. Shawcross, with the access, treated it as a charming throwaway and an Edwardian habit of mind. Vickers, in the 2005 biography that had drawn on a more limited access, treated the Queen Mother throughout as a more textured figure than the public myth, more willful, more managed, more practiced, without ever ruling on the specific line. Lady Colin Campbell's 2012 book, published by Dynasty Press and timed to the 10th anniversary of the death, took the maximalist view that the Queen Mother had been ruthless and that the public had failed to see it because she had managed the public's view of her with greater skill than any consort before or since. Vickers and the historian Michael Thornton dismissed Campbell's reading of related episodes, particularly Campbell's theory about the conception of her two daughters, as bizarre and complete nonsense. The dispute between Campbell and the rest of the field is, in the niche, a live one. What the disputants share is this: they all cite, in some form, her own assessment of herself. They disagree only on what she meant by it. There is a phrase that the audience for this channel has rolled around in its head for a long time, a phrase that lives a few inches above the self-quote in the household record. Cecil Beaton, the photographer who had spent 40 years close to the family, kept a private diary across the 1970s, in which he wrote his frankest observations of the people he photographed. The diaries were edited down once during his lifetime, in 1979, and published in a more presentable form. Then, in 2002, 12 years after his death, Hugo Vickers edited and published the diaries as Beaton had written them, in the volume The Unexpurgated Beaton. The phrase that has survived, in the form the audience now circulates, is that the Queen Mother was a marshmallow made of steel. Beaton's actual diary phrase was a quarter step harsher. He called her a marshmallow made on a welding machine. The image is not of two materials in alloy. The image is of a soft white sweet that has been deliberately fabricated by an industrial process intended for the joining of hard things. Beaton, who had photographed her in the war and again in the great formal sittings of the 50s, knew her well enough to see the seam where the marshmallow met the weld. He chose his words. The audience has, generously, smoothed them down. Place Beaton's welding machine line next to Shawcross's "I'm not as nice as I seem," and the two statements, one from outside the woman, by a man who had watched her work for 40 years, and one from inside the woman, by herself in a private letter, are saying very nearly the same thing. What did her own daughter hear when the line came up? The household record, transmitted via the biographer Ben Pimlott, is that the Queen had a specific response. Pimlott, whose 1996 biography of Elizabeth II is the canonical work of the modern reign, reported that when the Queen Mother's spending became a question, the Queen would respond with the formulation, "Oh, Mummy, grow up." Pimlott noted humor in the way the two women related. The household called it the exasperation register. The word "mummy," delivered with a particular drop, was the daughter's protest at being asked to mediate, again, between her mother's appetites and the institutional infrastructure that was paying for them. The phrase came back into wide circulation after the Queen's own death in September 2022, when several British wire services republished Pimlott's reporting as part of the obituaries. The audience for this channel has the same phrase, attributed in their comments to the same conversational mechanism. They know what it sounded like. They have known for decades. Place the daughter's "Oh, Mummy" against the mother's "I'm not as nice as I seem," and one hears, across the white space between them, a household exchange that had been running quietly for half a century. The next question is what the Queen Mother actually did when the moment came to act on the character she was admitting to. The clearest single case, and the one the audience will recognize instantly, is the matter of her younger daughter and group captain Peter Townsend. Townsend had been an equerry to George VI, decorated as a Battle of Britain fighter pilot, and the man with whom Princess Margaret had been in love for several years by 1953. In the summer of 1955, the constitutional question of whether Margaret could marry him reached its climax. The cabinet, under Anthony Eden, had prepared a workable solution. Margaret would have had to renounce her place in the line of succession for herself and her children, but she would have kept her status as a royal and her civil list income. The Prime Minister, in a letter set out for the Queen, had recorded that Her Majesty would not wish to stand in the way of her sister's happiness. The workable solution was on the table. On the 31st of October 1955, Margaret issued a statement, in her own name, declining to marry Townsend. The wording, drafted with care and read out from the steps of Clarence House, ran in part as follows. I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage, but mindful of the Church's teachings that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before others. What the household saw, in the months leading to that statement, was that the Queen Mother, who had been Margaret's principal source of advice and a daily presence in the unmarried daughter's life at Clarence House, did not support the marriage. The biographers have called this many things. The audience has called it one thing. The mother who had married a second son of a king, whose first daughter had been queen for 3 years, and whose second daughter wanted to marry a divorced commoner, made her position clear without ever putting it in a public sentence. Margaret took the position to be irrevocable. The line, in retrospect, "I'm not as nice as I seem," is not a statement that needs to be read into the Townsend file. It is a statement that, on the household's own evidence, accompanies the file. The Queen Mother had told her friends what she was. She then did, in the matter of her younger daughter's marriage, the thing that what she was suggested she would do. The line and the act, taken together, are the case. 3 biographers have set out the file. The audience has read it. There is a paired event from the other end of the same widowhood that the script has to handle with care, because the public version and the documentary version are not quite the same. On the 24th of April 1986, Wallis, the Duchess of Windsor, died in Paris. The Queen, having considered the question for many years, ordered that the burial take place at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, beside Edward VIII. The funeral service was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 29th of April. The brief on this video describes the moment in shorthand that the audience may have absorbed in the same shorthand. It is worth being precise. 175 mourners attended the service in St. George's Chapel. The Queen Mother was among them. Only 15 mourners then proceeded to the burial at Frogmore: the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, the Prince and Princess of Wales, the Dowager Countess of Dudley, 2 royal household aides, the Dean of Windsor, and 7 members of Wallis's personal household. The Queen Mother was not among the 15. The decision, on the published record, was made on the Queen's advice. The Princess of Wales would later report that this was the only time she had seen the Queen weep at a burial. The Queen Mother, who had carried the public version of her dislike of Wallis Simpson for 50 years, was, on the day, in the chapel, and not at the grave. The line about not being as nice as she seemed sits at a useful distance from both of those choices. She was capable of attending the chapel. She had absorbed enough of the institutional discipline of 50 years not to be absent from the chapel. The grave, on the household's count, was one step too far. The Queen, exercising authority that had not been exercised when she was a younger queen, told her mother not to go. The Pimlott, "Oh, Mummy, grow up" line and the 1986 Frogmore decision are, taken together, evidence of a shift in the relationship across the decades. In the early years of the reign, in the moments through 1955 and into the early 1960s, the mother was a counselor. By the late 1980s, the daughter had begun, in specific situations, to overrule. By the 1990s, when A.N. Wilson came to lunch and was given his Spectator scoop, the line, "I'm not as nice as I seem," had been sitting in the letters for at least a decade, and possibly several. The exasperation register from the Queen had matured into a working management style. The household phrase about the marshmallow and the welding machine by then was 30 years old. The audience, by the time of the 100th birthday in August 2000, was an audience that had absorbed the rhythm of these things and was on the balcony to celebrate the survival of it, not to interrogate the contents of it. The interrogation, when it would come from the next generation. Place Cecil Beaton's welding machine description against the Queen Mother's own letter to her friend, against Ben Pimlott's reporting on the Queen's, "Oh, Mummy, grow up," against the 1955 Townsend file, against the 1986 Frogmore absence. And what one is reading is not a series of separate documents. One is reading a single, 50-year, internally consistent statement of identity. The woman knew what she was. She told her closest friends in letters. She made the public choices that were consistent with the letters. The biographers, when they finally got into the archive, found her descriptions of herself sitting there in the same hand that had written the service of Thanksgiving notes and the Christmas card lists. There was no concealment in the strict sense. There was only the gap between what was written down for the public and what was written down for the closest friends. And the public, given a choice, preferred what was written down for it. The half-century pattern of public preference is worth naming with precision. The audience that turned out in the mall on the 4th of August 2000 was, in its great majority, an audience that had absorbed her wartime image as small children. The crowd that lined Whitehall for her lying in state on the 31st of March 2002 had absorbed the wartime image and 46 years of widowhood on top of it. The estimated 1,000,000 people who passed through Westminster Hall in the days before her funeral on the 9th of April 2002 were, by demographic, the same demographic. Older women predominantly, Anglosphere predominantly, women who had personal memories of the wartime Queen consort and personal investment in the Queen Mother as the figure she had become. The Coutts overdraft was £4 million at the moment of her death. The household at Royal Lodge was running with approximately 70 staff. The art collection had been quietly assembling for half a century. The audience knew about most of it. The audience did not, on the day of the funeral or in the weeks afterwards, hold most of it against her. The audience had made its decision about the Queen Mother long before the documentary fact base caught up. It is at this point that the line returns to its sharpest form. The reason the audience for this channel has held on to Sanda Steinberg 731's comment, the comment that quotes the 7-word folk version of the self-description and ends with the 3 words, "She was right." The reason that comment carries 110 likes is that the audience has caught up with the documentary fact base now. The Channel 5 documentary in 2001, the Shawcross biography in 2009, the Counting One's Blessings letters in 2012, the Campbell book in 2012, the Pimlott reissue of the Queen biography in 2002, then the 2022 Wire stories after Elizabeth II's death. The "oh, mummy" phrase working as the household's caption to 50 years of mother-daughter accounting. The Beaton diaries in their 2002 unexpurgated form. The Townsend file at the Cabinet Office. The Frogmore guest list at the royal household. The body of public evidence that supports the line as the woman's own honest summary of herself has been assembling for 25 years. The audience reads the comment threads. The audience knows the books. The audience says the line as a phrase between friends, the kind of phrase older women use when they have stopped pretending. What, then, does it mean that the public chose not to hear the line for 50 years? It means 3 things. It means, first, that the figure of the Queen Mother was a more useful figure as the public preferred her than as she described herself. The wartime grandmother was a unifying figure. The marshmallow was a useful image. The steel, or the welding machine in Beaton's harder phrase, was an inconvenient image. The British public, like every public, kept the useful image. It means, second, that the household and the institution did the work of maintaining the gap. The art collection was acquired quietly. The overdraft was covered quietly. The civil list allowance was set by Parliament, and the rest came from the privy purse, which is the sovereign's private property and which the Queen could deploy as she chose. The accounting was, for as long as it lasted, in the family. It means, third, that the woman herself collaborated. She wrote the line into her letters to friends. She did not write it into press statements. She knew what she was. She also knew what was required of her position. She delivered both, in proportion. This is the case the 7-word public version makes that the 6-word private version does not. The 7-word version, the one circulating on the audience's comment threads, and the one that gave Channel 5 its documentary title, is harder. The verb is, people think. It carries the indictment. It says she was telling them what she was, and they ignored her. The 6-word version, the one preserved by Shawcross from the letter she wrote to a friend, is softer. It says, "I'm not as nice as I seem," which sounds like the kind of thing a woman says into a cup of coffee on a wet afternoon, half rueful, half amused. The audience has chosen the harder version because the audience has read the file. The audience has decided that the woman's softer version, the one she set down in a letter, was the warning. The harder version, the version they have given her in their own re-rendering, is what the warning was warning them about. The closing argument is, in fact, the cost of the warning having been correct. The daughter of a woman who has admitted, in writing to her friends, that she is not as nice as she seems, is a daughter who has had to live with that document for as long as the document has existed. Pimlot's, "Oh, mummy, grow up," is what that living with sounds like in shorthand. The 1955 Townsend decision is what it looked like in policy. The 1986 Frogmore decision, the daughter sending her mother to the chapel but not to the graveside, is what it looked like in the daughter's first exercise of authority over her mother. The £4 million of overdraft, paid out of the privy purse, is what it looked like in cash flow. The 50 years of public composure on the daughter's face is what it looked like in the daily public record. Elizabeth II, on the published evidence, did not in her own lifetime use the line about her mother. The line had been on her mother's own desk. Her mother had told her in the same letters in which she told her friends. The daughter, by all the evidence the household has allowed to reach the printed page, did not need the line. She had been reading the document for 50 years. 7 words. She said them at Royal Lodge, at Birkhall, at Clarence House, in a letter, on a walk, after a lunch, to her doctor, to her detective, to her daughter the Queen. She said them for 30 years. The public, the press, the gift shops at the Tower of London, the children with their flags at the 100th birthday flypast, they all preferred the marshmallow. The steel was on the record the entire time. "I'm not as nice as people think I am." She was right.